I see turbulence across 2 continents. A man with a loud voice will rise and a shadow will fall over a neighboring land. Allies will become strangers. Friends turn cautious, and the world will watch in disbelief. The beginning is only one spark, but the fire is coming. In the summer of 2012, John Edward appeared on a live broadcast that would later become infamous among his followers. Viewers smiled politely, producers pressed him for clarity, but he only shook his head. The future, he insisted, never travels in straight lines. Yet, hidden in his words was a warning that would echo more than a decade later. The political and international storms ahead would be unlike anything the world had seen since the Cold War. Edward had already built a reputation as a communicator between worlds, connecting audiences with spirits of the departed, but in this alternative narrative, his gift extended further. Glimpses of global events. He claimed to receive impressions from energies, not just people, guiding him toward the tensions brewing between nations. The air in the studio crackled as he spoke of rising conflicts, hinting at leadership struggles, foreign interference, and unprecedented decisions. By 2015, Edward had begun traveling the country for private sessions, but some sessions were recorded anonymously by media outlets. In one such session, he described a man with a loud voice, a strange hair, a connection to a tower, and an international crisis that would be short, sharp, and shocking when the calendar shows 2 and 6. The description was vague, deliberately so, but it planted seeds of anticipation among his devoted followers. Edward's approach was theatrical, yet subtle. Symbols over specifics, metaphors like tower, spark, and shadow became his language. Avoiding exact dates, the 2 and 6 was a cryptic way of indicating 2026 without stating it outright. No moral judgment. He did not declare heroes or villains, only outcomes to be observed. In this alternate universe, Edward's method gained him credibility beyond entertainment. Political insiders, worried citizens, and curious students debated his impressions in online forums. By 2020, he was preparing a manuscript tentatively titled The 2-6 Window, focusing on rising global tensions, shifts in alliances, and an unexpected confrontation involving the United States and Venezuela. Edward's personal life intertwined with his work. He maintained secrecy around sources of inspiration, distancing himself from political opportunists. Yet envelopes from Washington occasionally arrived, requesting confidential readings. He claimed they were often empty of concrete information, yet they reminded him that influence could be subtle and dangerous. The first block closes with reflection. John Edward stood at the intersection of clairvoyance, media spectacle, and geopolitics. Whether imagined or real, his warnings began to shape the mental landscape of thousands who would later see events unfold almost exactly as he described them. And the spark he had sensed was about to ignite. By early 2023, the subtle warnings John Edward had shared over the past decade began to gain real-world echoes. Observers of global politics noticed fractures in alliances once thought unshakable. In private sessions, Edward spoke of a calm before the storm, a period where appearances of friendship masked growing suspicion. He described the United States as a ship navigating choppy waters, its leadership facing challenges not just domestically, but internationally, particularly in regions rich with natural resources and geopolitical leverage. Edward's descriptions were cinematic. He would close his eyes, hands slightly raised, and relay visions of 2 leaders. One brash, commanding attention at home with bold gestures and loud declarations. The other patient, cold and calculating, observing events from afar. The 2 men were connected by an invisible thread of rivalry, alliances, and unintended consequences. Edward's followers interpreted this as the tension between Donald Trump, the loud, unpredictable figure, and Vladimir Putin, who Edward suggested would intervene where he chooses, indifferent to protocol or expectation. The so-called Venezuela warning began as a vague impression, A country rich in oil and political unrest. Only the beginning of a chain reaction Edward saw unfolding across the Americas. He described colors, red and gold blending in the sky, and a sense of urgency, a feeling that decisions made in Washington could ripple far beyond borders. He rarely gave specifics but spoke in patterns, emphasizing the psychological and symbolic weight of actions. A hand will strike a country not yet prepared. The consequences will echo like a drumbeat across continents. Edward's popularity surged during this period. While mainstream media dismissed his statements as theatrical or metaphorical, dedicated followers documented every session. Online forums debated his credibility. Some called him a prophet, others a skilled showman. But the alternative reality in our narrative treats his visions as increasingly aligned with geopolitical trends, sanctions, resource disputes, and the breakdown of previously stable relationships. By mid-2024, Edward began making more pointed allusions in private readings. He spoke of two nations separated by oceans, but linked by power, influence, and ambition. The messages were indirect. Allies will waver, friends may falter, watch the towers and the flags, decisions made in one hemisphere will cause tremors in another. Those familiar with his work recognize the cryptic nature of his speech. Metaphors, symbols, and patterns meant to be interpreted carefully. Edward's method remained consistent. Symbols over specificity, avoiding names or dates directly, instead invoking imagery of towers, shadows, and waves. Cause and effect thinking. He viewed geopolitical decisions as ripples in a pond, each action producing subtle consequences before becoming visible crises. Psychological resonance. He focused on the mindset of leaders, the weight of ambition, fear, and rivalry. In the narrative, this period also explored Edward's human side. He expressed concern that his visions could be misused by opportunists or politicians seeking advantage. He took precautions. Sessions were recorded selectively, names obscured, and interpretations framed in hypothetical terms. Friends noted he often appeared somber after sessions, as though carrying a burden that went beyond public performance. By late 2025, Edward's private circle of believers began to understand the magnitude of his foresight. The 2-6 window. The year 2026 he had alluded to a decade earlier loomed on the horizon. He warned that actions in Venezuela were not isolated. They were catalysts. Alliances would be tested, personal ambitions clashed with international law, and the unexpected consequences of individual decisions would reverberate globally. The first half of this block focuses on subtle signals, military movements, economic sanctions, media coverage, and public sentiment. Edward described these as parts of a psychic map, where patterns of thought, behavior, and energy could be traced to predict outcomes. Even as his words remain metaphorical, the story presents them as eerily accurate precursors to events leading up to 2026. The block closes with Edward in reflection. He understood that prophecy is not destiny, but warning. He likened himself to a watchtower, seeing shadows on the horizon and alerting those who would listen. His followers recorded these warnings meticulously, noting how metaphor and imagery converged into a pattern that, while indirect, painted a coherent picture of conflict, rivalry, and consequence. As 2026 began, Edward's vision sharpened. He described a convergence of personalities and forces that could not coexist peacefully. Trump, loud, decisive, and accustomed to bold gestures, would face challenges unlike any before. Putin, patient, calculating, and deeply strategic, would intervene where he deemed necessary, not out of friendship or loyalty, but to shape outcomes according to his own objectives. Edward's followers recalled his warning. The man across the sea will not stand as an ally. He will test, provoke, and intervene in ways that even the loud man will not anticipate. Edward described the beginning of conflict as sharp, like a sudden storm. The story emphasizes symbolism over military detail. Flags and borders, media narratives, and economic levers become characters in the drama. In private sessions, Edward spoke of Venezuela as the first spark, a land rich in symbolism and conflict, whose instability would ripple across neighboring regions, forcing leaders to act under pressure. He imagined Trump responding with assertive action, while Putin's indirect interventions complicated the scenario. The narrative blends psychological insight with speculative events. Public perception is battleground. Edward suggested the loud leader would face domestic and international scrutiny, forced to balance image with strategy. Invisible hands. Putin's role is depicted as subtle manipulation rather than overt aggression, shaping events through alliances, information, and strategic pressure. Ripple effect. Venezuela's turmoil serves as a catalyst, impacting global markets, diplomacy, and public opinion. Edward also foresaw symbolic elements, towers, media, and communications becoming metaphors for power and influence. These visions resonate with American audiences familiar with political theater, emphasizing spectacle alongside consequence. By mid-2026, according to the narrative, tensions peak. Edward's followers noted that his warnings about unexpected consequences and rapid escalation proved prescient. The interactions between national leaders, their advisors, and regional powers created a chain reaction that mirrored the patterns he had described years earlier. Block 3 concludes with Edward emphasizing responsibility. Prophecy is warning, not inevitability. Leaders, citizens, and observers could mitigate outcomes through wisdom, foresight, and ethical decision-making. His visions, while dramatic, serve as cautionary tales, a blend of psychic insight and moral reflection. The final block explores the aftermath and enduring legacy of Edward's predictions. The narrative depicts events in Venezuela and interactions between Trump and Putin as unfolding according to the symbolic patterns he described. Edward reflects on his role, a messenger, interpreter, and moral compass for those willing to pay attention. The story emphasizes cultural and psychological impact, how Americans, international observers, and leaders respond to crises filtered through media, perception, and symbolism. Validation of insight. Edward's followers note correlations between his predictions and real events, enhancing his influence. Legacy of foresight, prophecy, as both entertainment and warning, lessons for political strategy, personal responsibility, and public engagement. The block closes with a meditation on uncertainty. While events unfolded in ways Edward suggested, the human element remained decisive. Choices, ethics, and courage shaped outcomes as much as prediction. The narrative ends with Edward in quiet reflection, a reminder that insight is a tool, not destiny, not